So we're talking about, before we're going on, we're talking about our cardinal rule about how to approach our relations with people that we don't necessarily get along with, the people that look a little different than us, people that look a lot different than us, but fall under the auspices of being American citizens. And I'm going to let my good friend Roberto explain the rule, the rule about how we talk on Progressive Soup and how we conduct our conversations.
Well, the basic rule is, if you go by the Constitution, and what the Constitution says is all men are created equal. They did leave out all men and women are created equal. And Martin Luther King, of recent fame, judged us by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. And, you know, these days, everything is referenced with the black guy or the African-American guy or the Hispanic, or they never seem to realize that we come in different shades from all nationalities. And one of my favorite characters is Bill Nye the Science Guy, because he has stated as plain as can be, there is one human race. That's it. We may be species of the human race, but there's only one human race. So when they talk about the race, this race, that race, they're very, very wrong. So we need to get off that dime. And as individuals, we really have to accept the fact that this is a country that has stated more than 1 billion times, it's the land of opportunity, whether you were born here, whether you've come here as an immigrant, or, you know, whatever the case, you have an opportunity to get a job, raise your family, do well, buy a house, and live the American dream. And that's what's at stake here for everyone. The American dream, as it was stated way back. So I hope we can get to that point.
And with that, we're off to the races. I'm David Stevenson, Roberto Perez, and Mark Morash. And we're going to talk about what, you know, we had some primaries, and our candidate did not win the primaries. He got about 46% of the Democratic Party votes. And we didn't get what we were looking for, but we always knew that there was something else after the election, after the primaries, for us to concentrate on, and we have been thinking about that long and hard, going back into the primaries, what we would do afterwards, where we would, how we would leverage our abilities, and where we would leverage our group of people, our 13+ million voters. And Mark Morash, where are we going? Get it started.
Where are we going? Is this the moment where we each announce our candidacy for president in 2020? It might be, but no. But I mean, and it's funny, but it's serious, because it takes that kind of legwork, starting now, thinking ahead, to be able to make candidacy happen. It's the signatures, it's the time frame from a local level up to a statewide level. And so, I often wonder if we wanted to all of a sudden found the Progressive Soup Party, and we wanted to get on the ballot in all 50 states, if we started today, could we get enough signatures all around the country to have a candidate on the ballot? Because you don't even need to have your candidate first. You can get ballot access and then provide your candidate later. So I think that would be kind of an interesting thing. And I think for me, my one, and maybe it's still to come, my biggest wish of what happened with the primaries is that the 13 million folks who voted for Bernie and all the folks who couldn't would found a party. And I don't know what to call it, because it's not as if we're all necessarily toting the same banner, but the people power there would be
the Progressive
stunning.
People Power Party?
Ooh,
that's
the 4 Ps. 4 Ps. We have soup.
We have split pea soup. We have lima bean soup. We have all kinds of.
That's true.
And
Old
No, I'm
man-
not even going to go there. These have a name other than seashells, and no, we're not going to go there. We've been advised probably not a good idea, so
Yeah,
we shan't go there. But so yeah, you're right. And looking back through history, we've talked about how the Green Party got started. We've talked about how the Working Families Party, the Libertarian Party. We've talked about how the Republican Party got started back in the 1850s, how they were nowhere, essentially, until very close to the moment where they got their candidate elected president in a very contentious presidential race.
Who was that guy? What was his name?
The other skinny guy from Illinois,
Okay.
other than Barack Obama, Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. So
There you
yeah.
go.
So yeah, it can happen. It could happen quickly then. It can happen quickly now. But as you say, it takes an awful lot of legwork to get a party named, to get it on the ballot in all 50 states. There are certainly a lot of roadblocks that are put up by the same folks that are running the debates. And we're not going to go into that because, we're not going to go into that.
We're not going into that.
We're not going into that. But yes. We're not going to wade into that water.
But it's interesting you mentioned that about Lincoln in 1860 because 4 candidates received electoral votes. And there was a time during these primaries where were all things created equal. I think it would have been very viable to see a true 4-party race coming into the end here in November. And in some way, there is a viable 4-party race happening. It's just being hidden under cover. And so when you think that in 1860, there was less hiding of the alternate parties than there is now, 150 years later, it's much, much more disturbing. So really, there should be a 4-party race going into that debate that we're not going to talk about.
Well, a lot of countries have multiple parties. I think Israel, I lost track. I think it's in the hundreds of actual political parties. And bravo to them, because what that forces them to do is that forces them to form coalitions after an election.
Correct. That's very important to have a
Now,
coalition.
how we could form a coalition prior to an election in America is by having something called instant runoff voting, where you mark your ballot with your first choice, and you vote for the person that you honestly believe is the best candidate for the job, whether it be out of 2, out of 4, out of 20 people on the ballot. And the ballot access will restrict it somewhat, but you might have 20 candidates, and you vote for the person that you think is the best qualified candidate first. Having said that, you mark a backup spot. So if you get through the first round, then your candidate is not the winner. All those votes are retabulated, where you have to run them through the machine again to note, or if they've already, the machines have already identified with the scanning, they've identified what the backup vote is for every single vote, who the backup candidate is, and then you go to your next round. Once the ones that don't have a chance to win are out, then you go to your backup and see how it shakes out.
And with that, do we then go the next step and get rid of the Electoral College?
There's a lot to be said for that. There's a lot to be said against that, I think.
Can you explain, Mark, a little bit about the Electoral College?
Okay, so here we are in Connecticut, and let's say 2 million people go to vote. This is a very biased explanation I'm about to give. And of those exactly 2 million votes, because statistics say you could get exactly 2 million voters, 1,000,001 people vote for candidate Spoon. 999,999 vote for candidate Napkin. So you win by 2 votes. 1,000,001 candidate Spoon gets Connecticut's 7? Are we at 7 now? What are we
I
at?
think it's 8, because I
We at
think you
8?
get the number of representatives plus your number of senators, which adds up to 2, and I think you get one extra one, I think.
I should know this, and I feel bad that I don't. But
It's either, we'll agree that it's either 7 or 8 electoral votes for Connecticut.
excellent. Candidate Spoon gets all 7 or 8 of those electoral votes. And what that means is that the 999,999 voters who voted for candidate Napkin, their votes
Out of luck.
don't count.
Count, which is not the way it should be.
No. So each state is worth X number of electoral votes. Someone has to get 270 for a majority. There are states that usually go blue. There are states that usually go red. And there's a handful of states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida that kind of flip-flop.
Purple.
And yes, exactly. And people make the argument that essentially this election, and almost every election, comes down to a few thousand, 10,000 voters in each of those states swinging that state, so that the rest of us can kind of go, well, okay, I know how Connecticut's going to go, more than likely.
Yeah.
Does my vote really count? If it was just a popular vote, it would be a different story.
So it's pretty clearly a matter of a very subtle voter suppression. If you live in a state where your vote's not going to make a hill of beans difference for the candidate that you would have voted for, you might say, well, if it were on a national level and it was an aggregate number of votes for the entire population, entire voting population in the country, then your vote certainly counts more than it does than it does in a state where you're, and it might work for the if you were supporting the person that you know is going to win your state. You might say, well, what's the point?
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, when you say voter suppression, what is the intent that you put forth as far as voter suppression? Is it certain members of one party going out and saying, you don't need to vote, don't worry about this, it's not going to affect you? Or is there something else combined to suppress someone's desire to go and vote for whoever they feel is the right person?
Well, if we didn't hear these polls nonstop, and every day there's a new poll, and in this case, with this election, this presidential election at least, it seems like the polls are swaying back and forth, and I'm quite convinced that the folks that are doing the polling, who represent media outlets, are very excited about swaying the numbers back and forth from one candidate to the other, because it creates a college football game kind of atmosphere where the candidate A says, oh my God, that horrible person for that other party might win. Oh, by the way, could you send a little money? Or the other party says,
bottom line.
Yeah, and that money comes in because people want to feel like they're part of the action. They've got a vested interest in creating advertising moments to help their candidate. Now, who benefits? In fact, benefits from this money flowing into the two parties? The media outlets, because that's where the money is going to go.
Advertising.
For advertising. So it's in their best interest to create a close election. Whether an election is going to be close or not, the last thing in the world they want is an election which is pretty clear as who's going to win. Because then the money stops flowing. The money stops flowing. The money stops flowing, and the money stops flowing into the media advertisers.
The president of CBS earlier in the campaign said Trump might be bad for America, but he's great for CBS advertising.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
For football fans, when the Super Bowl is a blowout, they always talk about how the ratings go down, and then they can't charge as much for advertising next time, and so there is the artificial competition, I guess.
It's all about the cha-ching,
Yeah.
the money.
And it's interesting about the Electoral College, and I won't be able to pull the stats directly, but if you go to archives.gov and go to their page about the Electoral College, this was something I happened to do the other night because I have a really exciting life, and so
Different things excite different people. I mean,
looking for cartoon inspiration.
it could be worse. You
you
could
have a
go
little
watching
baby
4
as
football
well,
games
Mark?
on Sunday. To me, that would have been a bigger waste of time.
Very much so. So learning, knowledge. And they talk about on the archives.gov, the government page about the Electoral College, how throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, they had polls where a far more than 50%, far more than a majority of Americans were for getting rid of the Electoral College. There was so much support, you would have thought. And then as you get down through the paragraph, it says, but the political scientists believe that there was some benefit in keeping the Electoral College. Didn't explain what the benefit was, but I found it fascinating that the government itself had done polling looking into the people's desire to have the Electoral College continue, and it just wasn't there.
I can give an example of why the Electoral College might be a good thing. It might be antiquated. It might be passé. It might be way back when. But back when you had paper and ballot boxes and people that had to be trusted on to count the ballots, it was very possible that one state could count their votes very incorrectly, and one state, by dint of chicanery, could swing an election for one candidate or the other.
Which seems to be an added part of the process now, where accusations being made that, well, how can we trust the ballot boxes? How can we trust the folks who are involved in making sure that the right person is voting? You know, the Voting Rights Act and the fact that you need a proper ID, yet some people, for whatever reason, may not have an ID that is accepted. So, born in America, born and raised, followed all the rules, never had need to drive, so I don't have a driver's license. I went to school, I may have had a college ID, but now I want to vote. And no, you can't
the college
vote.
ID doesn't work
Right.
in a lot of states.
So,
that's been challenged, and I think the challenges have been pretty much upheld. Having said that, there are still opportunities for there to be voting suppression.
So here's a question, perception question. When President Obama was elected in 2008, generally we consider that to be the highest voter turnout of however the last long, if not ever, general perception of it.
Yeah.
And during this round of primaries, the Democratic primaries, it was told to us time and time again that the voter turnout on the Democrat side was down. Yet we were told that all of these people were flowing in and registering to vote for the first time. So if President Obama's election year, vote turnout was up, this year for the primaries was down, why is it that there are multiple counties across the country where the number of votes that Hillary got versus Bernie sometimes doubles what President Obama received when he was running? The numbers are odd that if your overall is down, you would find a number of counties where the vote tallies for her are up. And if you try and research just this little bit of information, and it's something I'm working on, I'm not done yet, maybe by next episode, to find how many registered voters in a county becomes very difficult. Because between 2008 and 2016, many states redrew their lines. So if you're trying to compare apples to apples, you can't.
Yeah.
So to get valid
That's
information...
voting district lines.
Yeah,
Okay.
very much so. And so you can't even say, well, why are these numbers askew? Because you can't even easily get matched district to district from multiple. So now you could go in and try to get all of the cities and figure out, but then they split cities down the middle. And so even that makes auditing elections very difficult. Exactly.
Well, Connecticut's been very good at auditing, and nothing's really changed. The districts are, I think, identical. The congressional districts are identical to where they were. Well, it's a small state, so you know how much can the lines change in the span of 8 years? But I think there's a more cogent reason why in some states why voting was down. And it comes back to the Voting Rights Act being put aside by the Supreme Court. Because the Voting Rights Act put a lot of pressure on states that have a history of voter suppression from doing anything to change their voting rules without oversight by the federal government. Having said that, now a state like Arizona changed their voting situation in that they cut back significantly on the number of places where you can vote. And they say it's because it's a cost-saving thing. But what that does, it prevents a lot of voters from having this easy time of getting to the polls. If you've got to travel twice as far. And again, back to your mention of what if you don't have a car?
Exactly. Or if the public transportation in your part of town is, instead of every 25, 35 minutes, it's every hour and 20 minutes.
Yep.
You know, that's definitely going to affect what happens.
Now, if you have a good turnout under those circumstances, you have long lines because you have more people going to fewer voting places, so you have longer lines. And people that maybe don't have 4 hours to stand in line, maybe they've got kids they need to go get somewhere. Maybe they've got other things they need to do in their life, and they've allotted an hour maybe to stand in line in order to cast their ballot. Now they've got to wait maybe 4 hours, and that was the case in many, many precincts in Arizona, particularly in Maricopa County, which is Phoenix, essentially Phoenix. When you have that happen, you put a lot of people in a position where they have to decide whether they're going to vote or whether they're going to get their kids after school or what they're going to do, or whether they have to work a couple hours extra and that prevents them from making an easy trip to the voting booth. And it causes a lot of problems. That in and of itself is voter suppression. That is what a lot of us were concerned about when they talked about taking the Voting Rights Act off the table and allowing states, because about 15 seconds after the Voting Rights Act was off the table, states like Texas and North Carolina had already had new laws ready to be signed, ready to be voted on, bang, signed, bang, changes made. And trust me, they were never changes that benefited folks that weren't wealthy enough to have all day to, at their leisure, cast a vote.
Would you call that a conspiracy?
It's a fact. It's just a fact. It's just a fact, and we anticipated that would happen. We were prepared, but there really was nothing you could do about it, because if you have a state legislature that's entrusted with making laws for their state, they wield that power. They wield that power.
The magic word, trust.
Yeah.
Can you trust those that you've elected to put forth the issues that are important, not just to you and yours, but to everyone on the equal playing field? One of the biggest things that I think is so wrong right now in the country is the education system. It's not on a level playing field.
No.
So how do we fix the education system so that everyone gets the opportunity to be educated and then decide, well, I may want to be a plumber, or maybe I want to be a rocket scientist. You know, those things are being denied in a lot of areas.
Let's bring that back home. Let's bring that back home to Connecticut, because Connecticut had a court case, Sheff versus O'Neill, when O'Neill was governor, that questioned the equality of education in Connecticut between the wealthier school systems and the poorer school systems. And clearly, kids in poorer school systems didn't have the tools that were given to the kids in the wealthier school systems. And they brought something into play to make an attempt to correct that, called educational cost sharing, where the state gives back proportionately to poorer districts more money than it gives to wealthier districts.
There was an article in the New York Times the other day, and I had no idea, and it was stunning to me, but there was a case recently in Connecticut again, and talking about that, and reading that in Bridgeport, they had to cut busing for high school students because they didn't have the money.
Again, the money.
But I mean, I know when I was in college that walking 5 minutes across campus on a snowy day was a very, very difficult thing. And you're asking high school kids to have to find their own way to school?
And if you don't have mass transportation as the alternative and effective mass transportation, I'm not going today because the snow's too deep, or it's raining too hard, or I can't get my friend to drop me off. So there are
Or the dog eats your galoshes.
There you go. You know, the roadblocks.
Now, not to be flip about that, but you're right. There was a rehashing of this educational system in Connecticut because clearly you still have wealthier systems with a disproportionate amount of money per student, and poorer systems having a disproportionately less amount of money per student, which wasn't solved by the educational cost sharing. All that did was set community against community, complaining about, well, we don't think we got enough. And in a lot of cases, locally, Brookfield is constantly talking about how they don't get enough money. But here's the rub. Richer systems have wealthier families. And the one thing you cannot legislate is how much money wealthier families, we're going to come back and do a second show and continue on with this, but the wealthier towns with the wealthier families can always put their own personal money in to get their kids the extracurricular activities that poorer families and poorer communities cannot. Simple as that. And we're going to continue the discussion. We'll come back and do a second show and pick up where we left off. This is Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. Roberto Perez and Mark Moresh, thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow at noon 30.